it could summon ill will. For decades, rumors swirled. Disappearances, faint lights in the windows at night, and strange cries carried by the sea breeze. One Friday evening, Thomas Fletcher, a journalist struggling to keep his small local paper afloat, received a message. It was a formal letter, an invitation sealed with a wax stamp that bore an elaborate G. The note read, "Mr. Fletcher, I have information about Grangewood Manor that may be of interest to you. Meet me at the abandoned gate at twilight. Come alone." Despite the mysterious tone, curiosity gripped Thomas. Asterton was starved for solid leads or any unusual story worth printing, and Grangewood Manor was the biggest local mystery there was. If he uncovered something genuine, it might save his paper from financial ruin and satisfy his own restless fascination. So, as the sun sank over the ocean and twilight crept into the sky, Thomas made his way up the winding dirt path that led to the iron gates of Grangewood Manor. As the evening grew darker, the wind picked up in strength, rattling the ornate bars. No one greeted him at the gate. He waited, peering through the rusted metal. The manor's facade was a collage of boarded-up windows and cracked stone pillars, the roof crowned with rotting shingles. Weeds burst through the cobblestones, giving the sense of a place frozen in time, left to decay alone. Still, no sign of the mysterious letter writer. But then, he thought he heard a soft voice whisper his name, Thomas. It was almost too faint to be certain. He spun around, searching. Nothing but darkness. Was there more to uncover, or was it just rumors? Early the next morning, Thomas decided to return in daylight, his investigation fueled by equal parts fear and excitement. The iron gate was locked, but he hopped the fence and found himself facing the manor's grand entrance. An old keyhole glinted, but the door wouldn't budge when he pressed on it. He circled the building, stepping over tangled vines and patches of thorny bramble. At the back of the house, a smaller side door sat rotting on creaking hinges. With only a slight shove, it opened into a narrow corridor. The air was musty, thick with a dampness that clung to the walls like a stale memory. Inside, the hallway stretched into darkness, but specks of daylight filtered through a tall window, illuminating swirling motes of dust. Thomas carefully set his camera bag and notebook by his side. He had promised himself he'd capture everything, just in case. He ventured deeper into the manor, past moth-eaten drapes and a battered chandelier that teetered ominously from the ceiling. Faded portraits hung on the walls. Each painting depicted stern-looking men and women with the same sharp features. High cheekbones, piercing eyes, and lips pressed into thin lines. Below one painting, a tarnished plaque read, Cedric Grangewood, 1852 to 1910. A sense of dread followed Thomas's every step. The boards creaked in protest, as if warning him to turn back. In the silence, he almost believed he could hear the faint echo of footsteps trailing behind, never quite catching up. Eventually, he found what appeared to be a large parlor. The walls were adorned with dusty tapestries, and a row of bookshelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Thin shafts of sunlight streamed through cracks in the boarded-up windows, illuminating scattered debris. A broken chair here, a shattered vase there. On a table in the center, an old journal caught his eye. The leather cover was cracked and moldy, but it was propped open, as if inviting him to read. He hesitated only briefly before picking it up. The pages were filled with looping script, June 13, 1908. The rumors persist. They say the Grangewoods consort with spirits, that the house sits on haunted ground. I fear there is truth to it all. Thomas flipped further in. August 2nd, 1909. They've sealed off the basement now. I've heard wailing noises at odd hours, like souls in torment. My fiancé begs me to leave, but I can't, not until I know for certain what the family has done. The final entry was smudged by water or tears. January 14th, 1910. I confronted them today. I saw, dear God, I saw that it's real. This house, it was never meant to be a home. It's some twisted shrine. But who will believe me? Thomas's hands trembled. He snapped several photographs of the journal's most legible pages. The text sparked dozens of questions. If someone had confronted the Grangewood family about something unspeakable, what had they discovered? Suddenly, he heard the same whispery voice he'd heard the night before, drifting through the parlor. "Thomas!" He jumped, knocking over the camera. The voice was more distinct this time. Every hair on his neck prickled as he slowly rose to his feet. "Who's there?" he called. Silence. Then a scrape from the hallway. He rushed toward the sound. His footsteps echoed in the corridor, turning corner after corner. At last, he reached a wooden staircase, leading down into darkness. A basement? Possibly the very one the journal mentioned. Thomas pointed his flashlight into the stairwell. Each step was slick and smelled of rot, as though water or something worse had leaked in over the years. The air grew colder and heavier the further he descended. At the foot of the stairs, he emerged into a sprawling basement with stone walls. Old crates and barrels were stacked in precarious towers, covered in mildew. A rusted iron door stood on the far side, partially ajar. He inched closer, flashlight shaking in his grip. The door led to a small chamber with a low ceiling. The walls were etched with crude symbols, half eroded by time. Broken candles, melted down to lumps of wax, lined a battered wooden table. Everything felt ancient, as if from some long-forgotten ritual. In the middle of the table lay a dusty pendant shaped like an eye. It was heavy, made of a strange metal that glinted eerily under the flashlight beam. Without thinking, Thomas picked it up. A jolt, like static electricity, surged through his hand. He gasped and dropped it back on the table. For a fleeting second, the chamber filled with a quiet moaning sound, like the wind passing through a hollow pipe. Thomas's pulse hammered in his ears. He looked around, heart pounding, convinced he was no longer alone. Then he felt warm breath on the back of his neck. He spun around, shining his flashlight wildly, but there was no one there. The voice whispered again, "Thomas, come further." His flashlight flickered, threatening to go out. Shaken to his core, Thomas retraced his steps, stumbled up the staircase, and darted down the corridor until he found the exit. He burst back into the open air, chest heaving. Thomas had seen and heard enough to suspect that the rumors about Grangewood Manor were more than mere town gossip. Maybe the house really was cursed. Or maybe it was a place of dark, unspoken secrets that had shaped the Grangewood legacy for generations. He decided he needed backup. He called his old friend Josephine Jo Myers, an amateur historian who specialized in local lore. She arrived the next day with stacks of old documents. The two of them spread everything out on Thomas's kitchen table: maps, property records, a genealogical chart of the Grangewood family. Joe discovered that Cedric Grangewood's father was rumored to have practiced unnatural arts. Though specifics were scarce, local tabloids had once claimed these arts involved summoning spirits. Several servants vanished in quick succession in 1909, and townsfolk whispered it was due to monstrous experiments happening in the manor's basement. That evening, Joe convinced Thomas to return to the manor. "This time, we'll be careful," she assured him, though her voice trembled slightly. "We'll document everything, see if we can locate more clues about what those symbols mean, or who invited you in the first place." Night settled on Asterton, cloaking Grangewood Manor in blackness. The wind off the sea rattled the ivy clinging to the walls as Thomas and Joe slipped through the side door with flashlights and cameras. The interior felt colder than before. They made straight for the basement. Each step on the staircase echoed in the silence, accompanied by the distant hiss of the ocean breeze through cracks in the stone. In the small chamber, the pendant still lay on the table. Joe's eyes widened as she studied the etchings on the walls. "I recognize some of these," she said quietly, running her fingertips over the carvings. "They're part of an ancient script, something I've only seen referenced in obscure occult texts." Thomas lifted the pendant, bracing himself for another shock. Nothing happened this time, though a subtle tremor seemed to course through his arm, almost like a faint pulse. He handed it to Joe. She pressed it in her palm and closed her eyes, as if half expecting a sensation or message. Then they noticed the corridor continued deeper under the manor. Another locked iron door stood at the far end. Joe tried it, but it wouldn't budge. The old lock resisted their efforts until, at last, the hinges groaned and gave way under Thomas's combined weight and a makeshift crowbar. Beyond the door was a pitch-black tunnel. The stale air reeked of age and something foul. Even their strongest flashlight struggled to cut through the darkness. Their footsteps sounded unnaturally loud, each scuff on the cold ground echoing back at them in an uncanny way. After several minutes of navigating the twisting passage, the tunnel opened into a circular stone room. The walls were lined with tall, warped mirrors that distorted their reflections. In the center stood a raised stone dais with a pedestal on top. What lay upon that pedestal made both Thomas and Joe freeze. A set of human bones, carefully arranged in a macabre display. The skull wore what looked like a metal circlet. The dusty remains were adorned with old coins, all bearing the same all-seeing eye symbol as the pendant. Thomas's flashlight flickered again, as though responding to the grisly tableau. Joe leaned in close to read an inscription carved into the dais. "Through the eye we see, through the bones we awaken, through the family we endure." Joe's voice shook. This must have been the center of their ceremonies. These bones, could they be one of the family members? Before Thomas could reply, the entire room seemed to vibrate. A soft cry echoed around them, emanating from the mirrors. One by one, the mirrors clouded over with a thick, swirling mist. Thomas and Joe glanced at each other, fear etched into their faces. Then, in one of the mirrors, the shape of a tall figure appeared, dark, indistinct. The voice they had heard before grew louder, but it was overlaid with more voices now, a chorus of hushed pleas, as if souls trapped behind the glass were calling out. The dark figure leaned closer, as though trying to step through the mirror. Thomas instinctively gripped the pendant, a surge of cold energy coursing up his arm. The shape recoiled. Joe shouted, "Use it! Maybe it's supposed to keep the entity at bay." Thomas raised the pendant toward the mirror. Its metallic surface glowed with a strange luminescence. The figure let out an anguished hiss, and the swirl of mist dissipated. The mirror's surface cleared, and the other mirrors followed suit, their swirling dark shapes retreating into oblivion. A final gust of wind, or was it a sigh, swept through the room. The oppressive sensation lifted, replaced by an eerie stillness. Thomas and Joe felt as though they had come upon the end of something ancient and sinister that was never meant for living eyes. They left the manor at dawn, hearts pounding, the pendant in hand. Back at Thomas's small newspaper office, they pored over their notes. What they'd witnessed seemed beyond rational explanation, yet it corroborated so many of Asterton's darkest rumors. They had photographic evidence of the chamber, the bones, even the bizarre symbols. But would anyone believe them? When Thomas published a cautious version of the story, omitting the more supernatural details, Asterton was thrown into tumult. Many dismissed it as sensationalized fiction. Yet a portion of the population wondered if the madness of the Grangewood family had indeed left an indelible mark on the old estate. Old-timers who'd experienced strange happenings as children felt vindicated. Others felt threatened that their quiet coastal life was being upended by ghost stories. In the midst of the controversy, an unsigned letter arrived at Thomas's desk. There is more to Grangewood Manor than you know. If you value your safety, do not pry further. For Thomas, it was both a warning and a challenge. He had to decide if this story was worth pursuing deeper, risking both his own life and possibly Joe's. Or should he let sleeping ghosts lie and preserve whatever fragile peace remained in Asterton? Joe believed that confronting the manor again might be a mistake. "We forced something to retreat," she said. "We might not be so lucky a second time. If that was just a whisper of the evil that once dwelled there, what else could be awakened?" In the weeks that followed, Grangewood Manor stood unchanged on its windswept cliff, silent as ever. Yet neighbors whispered they still saw faint lights flickering at night, like distant lanterns dancing behind the boarded-up windows. A fisherman claimed he saw shadowy figures pacing along the upper balconies, disappearing when he sailed closer. Thomas remained torn. He had glimpsed enough to suspect that the Grangewood's unnatural arts might never be entirely gone. Perhaps the rituals, the bones, and the swirling mists were all anchored to that haunted place, bound by centuries of dark practice. But how could he be certain without another investigation? Late one night, Thomas found himself standing by his office window, staring at the manor's silhouette across the moonlit bay. The gentle waves lapped at the shore, a lullaby for the restless. Clutched in his hand was the pendant. Despite everything, he felt an inexplicable pull to return. Was there more to uncover, or was it just rumors? He couldn't answer that yet. But somewhere within the cold halls of Grangewood Manor, he was sure there remained something waiting. Whether it was the restless spirit of a wronged servant, the echo of a tormented ancestor, or a curse that fed off mortal curiosity. For now, Thomas tried to sleep, though visions of the swirling mist and the skeletal remains on the dais haunted his dreams. Asterton's rumors, half-truths, and whispered secrets weren't going away. If anything, they had become part of his story. And in the darkness of that ancient house on the cliff, whatever had stirred was now keenly aware that someone had dared to trespass on its domain. Thomas suspected, with a growing dread and fascination, that he'd only scratched the surface. He would have to decide if he dared to scratch any deeper.